Good morning, everyone. Now we are going to listen to a very interesting research project by Dana Mustata. You may know her. She is the chair of the Media Studies Commission and professor at the University of Groningen. Her presentation is entitled Media Past as Living Cultural Archives. Dana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you everyone for being here. My presentation today, sort of the inspiration behind my presentation today was a book called Data Feminism that says when we talk about digital data, when we talk about also the different tools, digital tools we use to access this kind of data, we always need to be aware of the kind of inequalities, whether social, political, cultural, that these kind of practices are embedded in. So in my talk today, I am going to focus on context of archival scarcity, not to stay focused on the scarcity itself, but to perhaps turn the gaze back onto the analog when we do, in my case, media history and television history, turn that gaze back onto the analog to think about how do we go about doing research and doing histories when the material that we access is sometimes not there, is absent, but also when the material we access, sometimes the true value of it needs to be put under the question mark. So I will be while I will be showing you different forms of scarcity that archival scarcity took in post-communist and communist Romania, I will try to, from that, develop some questions and reflections on how can we think about doing archival research and working with archives in such contexts, and perhaps what different methods do we need to look at these archives in different ways. So perhaps it's no novelty that during my research on Romanian television history under communism, the kind of archival material that I have encountered was very much filled with biases, a lot of propaganda material, for instance, whereas when I was talking with people that had worked in television at that time, they were telling me, well, things were not that black and white. We also had some practices on how to fool the censors, for instance. Anyway, what's in the archived and documented, this is filled, as I was saying, with biases, obliterations, things that were left out, silences, also contradictions, but also some materials are plain inaccurate. And also if we talk about archives that were produced by the former communist secret police, those are very much veiled into a language of secrecy and into a language code language, I would say, that I, as a researcher, even now I don't have the full tools to understand the kind of metadata that appears on the documents themselves, and I will show you some of them. So during my research on Romanian television, I have accessed different types of archival materials and archival collections. I've worked with the audiovisual archives at TVR, the Romanian public broadcaster. I've worked with the radio and television files that were produced by the former communist secret police, which are now kept at the Council for the Study of the Securitate Archives. I have stumbled across unarchived written documents at TVR, and I have also did interviews with professionals that have worked at TVR under communism. And now and then I have tried to fill in some gaps using the press at the time, so newspaper clippings. So when I started my research at TVR, I was accessing all this propaganda material. And what I also encountered was that a lot of material, people were telling me in the interviews, well, you know, if you look at this program in the 1980s, it's all full of propaganda, but the same program in the 1960s, for instance, were showing people turning their backs on the parties in protest of things that were happening in the country at the time. And those documents are not in the archives. The program maker of that, it was a social enquete program called Reflector, would tell me, for instance, in an interview that, for instance, by the end of the 80s, many records of that particular program from the 70s were destroyed. And he says, I quote, "At the end of the 80s, someone fought, maybe at Ceausescu's order, to get rid of these programs in the archives under the pretext of taking out the silver out of the film reels." That was the time when there was a lot of scarcity, economic scarcity in Romania, and there were a lot of restrictions and a lot of economizing practices going on, being imposed on TVR at the time. So they were taking the silver out of the film reels, thus destroying that archival material. So he says, "We're now left without some of most important documents of that era, valuable documents that would, about what would happen in a society pretending to be perfect." Indeed, this was a program that was in the 60s and 70s criticizing the party. That was the true history of Romania, not the triumphalist reportages that were shown. When I talk to people, for instance, program makers from TVR, they would tell me that because of what was happening in the 1980s in TVR, all these economizing practices, they wouldn't leave their master copy of the program that would make in the archives. They will take it back home with them so that, the material wouldn't be in danger. So that means that a lot of material ended up in private hands. Something else that happened, for instance, a practice that, so because of the economizing policies that were taking place, they had to reuse or film over old film reels. Sometimes they also had to recycle these old film reels. And what they would do, if they needed, I don't know, let's say a cut of a material showing people in the street, they will literally physically cut the old film reel, cut into that tape, then tape that over the new film reel, and then when I went into the archive, sometimes I would have all these old film reels to watch, and then the sound was very small, and then the image much bigger, or vice versa, because indeed there were chunks missing out of the original film reels. And when I was watching all this on an old Steinbeck machine, indeed it kept breaking up at the point where these materials were patched over. So indeed there are all these absences in the archives that I had to work with. Then there are also things that were happening but not according to what was shown in documents. So for instance, these are copies of the television guides at the moment, copies that clean copies. This is not a clean copy. I'll explain what this is in a bit. But copies that, for instance, people would buy at the time to find out the TV program. The clean copies of this you can find, for instance, at the National Library, National Archives. These are the internal copies at TVR. And what you see on these copies is all these handwritten notes, which shows the programs that actually were supposed to be broadcast but were never broadcast. So, and these are, again, not archive material. So this is actually the accurate portrayal of what was actually broadcast. And this is the only portrayal of what was broadcast on television, because if we access the same television guides in other archives, we would find programs in there that were never actually broadcast. And then, as I was saying, there are also other types of documents, such as Securitate files. And these are samples from the Securitate files. This is the surveillance file of a Finnish journalist from Yle, the Finnish broadcaster. His name is Liorinski. Liorinski, sorry about the air quotes, it was his actual name. But you see in these documents, he's given a code name, Larsen. In this first document here, we see that a source called Iliuț, who was surveying and probably also accompanying, he might be among these people here, but I have no way of knowing, because I only know the code name of that person. So yeah, this person was receiving money because of his, helping out to, in this operation. The operation was called the operation was called the Finnish Man. So if I look at Securitate Archives, there are all these code names, code language that is being used, and many times the real names, in this case I have the real name of in the same file of the journalist, but many times the real names are not, you cannot find other documents that connect these code names to the real names. And for instance, here, there is a file of someone, this was a former TVR professional. We see this person here with the code name. For her, I found in the Securitate Archives documents, they also mention her real name. But For many other people, I have not found the real names, which for me as a researcher is a big question mark. And also because of that, as a researcher, I have taken the decision not to make public the names of the people who have worked in TVR under communism, who may have collaborated with the Securitate. I don't know, based on the files and my reading of the files, I cannot say that, nor can I say why for some people we have the real names of them and for others not. So there's a political mechanism there of deconspiring and secrecy that as a researcher I didn't want to participate in. And then what we also have on that document, you see all these writings. So that's a document. It's an interception of a telephone call made by a television viewer to the public broadcaster complaining that the TVR was not broadcasting the game between the Bucharest team, Steaua Bucharest and Sparta Praga. Anyway, why I'm showing this material, if you see all those other sort of handwritten notes on this file, that's really important historical material that I cannot fully make sense of because of the code language. I see someone or something called S5 on these files that keeps, and based on the comment he makes there, why am I not informed what happens to these people who call the broadcaster? That is a person behind S5, but who that person is, I cannot trace it. And then indeed, if I am to look at all the metadata on these files, if I look at this file here, we see different types of numberings on this file. In the top, left corner, we see 402. That's the numbering as the file appears in the Securitate files as they are present now in the archives, but we see other numberings there that are deleted, 54, 45, 78, 84, which means that this particular document went through many different files. And what happens to every time these documents were moved from one file to another, I still have questions about that. So what I've learned while I was doing my research is that, when I was researching the Securitate Archives, I got the picture inevitably that the Securitate were these sort of almighty eyes surveying everyone, knowing everything. But then when I talked to people at TVR, they would tell me, well, it wasn't always like that. For instance, we are not allowed to listen to Radio Free Europe when we're in our offices, but some of us did, and nothing ever happened to us. Then I have here also a quote from a former program maker at TVR who said, for instance, we were in another city filming. We checked in with the local party officials, although nobody obliged us to do so. But there were certain benefits if we did: a better hotel, free meals, which allowed us to put some money aside for our families. They told us to join them at the restaurant where they were having dinner after we were done filming. They would order food and spritzers for us. A big dinner was prepared for us. And then he would say the higher the amount of alcohol we consume, the more the conversation would turn to political issues. Someone would say, isn't Ceausescu planning to die anytime soon? We, including the Securitate officers who would join in on these dinners, all ended up swearing and using obscene words about Ceausescu and Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu. The next day, none of us were arrested, and no one would ever mention those conversations except that it had been a perfect evening. So interviews like this would somehow collapse or put under question mark the impression I got about the Securitate from the Securitate Archives. And then there is the work of Catherine Verdery, who is a sociologist and anthropologist who did research on Romania at the time, and she accessed her own Securitate file. And she published an ethnography of the Securitate and her own Securitate files. So what she says is everything we know about how Securitate files were put together diminishes their likely truth value. Informers reported under duress, out of malice, or inaccurately. Case officers made tendentious interpretations that suited their ends. Destruction of files left enormous lacuna in the corpus. Agents opened files on people even when their recruits refused to cooperate. The demands of the plank economy set performance targets that compel sloppy work. Competition among officers and branches of the Secret Service aggravated that tendency, and so forth. In conclusion, by inscribing, she says, the Securitate Archives as a site of truth about the past, post-communism simply propagated its logic into the present. So indeed, here we put on the question mark the whole true value of archives. And in the absence of that, as a researcher, of course, I start asking question, okay, how can I engage with archives? Is there true, if not as sites of truth, but then as sites as what? Other examples, for instance, a lot of unarchived documents that I found in the basement of TVR looking for written documents that they would have on their building and the architecture of the building, archives that the documents that the archives themselves didn't know about and are not cataloged either. Among these documents on archives, for instance, this is an official document showing the official authorization for starting the building of the TVR tower in Bucharest. Again, a document dumped in the basement of TVR. And then there are also practices that perhaps we all know about, censorship. And every program had to go through what was called a visa. Initially, these visas, as this quote says here, was a political visa, but later on it got stricter and stricter and stricter to the point that that censorship turned into self-censorship. People knew what they were not, what they couldn't say. Or sometimes they explained they had their own tricks to fool the censors during the screening meetings that a program had to go through. When they knew there was a problematic or sensitive part in the program, they would, for instance, someone would cough or distract the censor, and sometimes they managed to get more sensitive programs through the censors that way, but sometimes not. So indeed, also this kind of censorship practices raises questions about what do we call a silence in the archive. So then, to go back to my sort of initial questions, then if we have this context in which skepticism surrounding Romania's archive communist past is a justifiable sentiment, and where the true value of documents archival documents needs to be put under question mark, then we need to look behind traditional archives and to find perhaps other alternative repositories of the past in the present. And here I borrow from Gloria Vecker's term cultural archive that she uses in a book called White Innocence, which she defines as the presence of the past into the present, a way of acting that people have been socialized into that becomes natural, escaping consciousness. So I'm trying to use this term to approach the past of Romanian television under communism as a cultural archive, something that is still part that we can find in the present, in discourses, ways of speech, emotions, also attitudes, thoughts that are very much in the present Romania nowadays, which are continuously reproduced yet naturalized into the present, and indeed may help me as a researcher to understand the context of the past. And to sort of, I'll dive a little bit into this to unpack it a bit more, and I'll start with two self-reflections on two encounters I've had around my research in the archives of Romanian television. And this was one of them. At a conference on Romanian communism that was held in Bucharest in 2016, I presented my research that I had done at the BBC Written Archives that shows this person here in the center, Silviu Brucan, who was the vice president of Romanian television between 62 and 65, who was visiting the BBC at the time. In the BBC documents, and I present there some quotes, he was presented as someone wanting to modernize television, wanting to bring the West into Romanian television, and they note about him, he's their equivalent of our Director General. He's most engaging and amusing person, and his English is fluent. I found him an excellent company and very ready to talk freely, even dangerously. He professes a lifelong admiration of the BBC and so forth. So when I presented this part of my research at that conference, I got very, very strong reactions and very strong emotions, with some of the senior historians in the room saying he has no place in the history of Romanian television. He is someone who has sent people to jail during Romanian, back in the 40s and 50s. And indeed, other historians write about him. This is another historian saying that that particular person wrote indictments in the Romanian daily Scânteia that demanding the liquidation of different Romanian politicians. He wrote virulent texts to the leaders of the democratic parties in Romania after the war, who were imprisoned because of his party. He did all this by playing his takes on Western support or pretending to do so. So indeed, this left me with questions. Okay, how do we tell histories? Who has the right and what? Yeah. And then there was another encounter during the interview that I had that for a long time, and still now, I'm still trying to sort of wrap my mind around it, where someone that I was trying to interview told me up front, and this I use here, the quotes the person used: "There is no one in this country capable to write a history of Romanian television. And I'm fed up with people who pretend to be able to do so." And then she also said, "We used to have one of the best televisions in Europe." Then she also said up front at the start of the interview, "I will tell you what I want you to tell you, and not what other people at your university in the West." I was affiliated to Utrecht University in the Netherlands, doing a PhD as a Romanian on Romanian television. Not what people at your university in the West want you to write about. And then towards the end of the interview, she made a remark where she said, "You see, you can now do your doctorate, your PhD in the West. By my youth, we're not allowed to travel to the West." For a long time, I thought I cannot use that material, and I haven't used it because I thought she never answered my questions. But then going back to that interview, I'm thinking, is there something in that interview that could count as research data for me? And what I find interesting here is the attitude that she had and also the strong emotions that she had. And if I look closely at what she was saying, you see, you can now do your doctorate in the West, but in my youth, we're not allowed to travel to the West. This is a person whose youth was pretty much locked up in that country. And then she said, "Well, I will tell you what I want to tell you. Yeah, this is someone who couldn't talk freely in public television under communism. And then there is no one in this country capable to write a history of Romanian television. Yes, who is that person who is going to tell the history of her, pretty much most of her youth and life in that public broadcaster? Is it me or someone else?" Later on, I'll go through this because of lack of time quickly. I found, for instance, this book which shows, for instance, prizes that TVR won at different international competitions. For instance, a movie like this by Valeriu Lazarov, who later on moved to Spain, won in 1966. It's a musical film at different festivals. When I came across this book, I remember her and I thought, oh, is this maybe what she meant, that we used to have one of the best televisions in Europe? Because when she stated that, I was like, no way. I mean, there's no comparison. So I really looked down on, of course, in my head. But thinking back, reflecting on these sort of encounters I had around my research that was very much based on archival research, I now wonder, after many years, how have I, as a television historian of socialist Romania, been responsible for maintaining in place the antagonisms of the socialist past? To that interviewee that I went to, what I represented for her as a PhD student coming from the Netherlands, a Romanian affiliated to a university in the Netherlands, researching the history of the institution where she had worked, I represented for her everything she did not, that was denied to her. And indeed, for me, I find interesting as a researcher these strong emotions and attitudes that are still lingering, that also reflect in how people speak about the communist past. So then, one argument that I want to make is that in a media past that remains contested and contentious, and where encounters with or around archives remain permeated by strong emotions, affective responses, how do we work with archives in ways in which we can account for such deep-seated emotions and affect? Because I do believe, although I'm still working with it, that these tell us much more than archives, the archives as they are right now, can tell us. Can such deep-seated emotions and affect that emerge from archival encounters served as historical documents that people carry with them, so embodied historical documents of the present, but that can tell us something about the past? And I argue that these present-day encounters that bring up all these strong emotions around Romania's communist past may be a continuation of the social relations that Romanians had with the communist regime, or also during the communist regime at the time, and they echo sentiments, feelings, emotions that for me strike a very close resemblance to the emotions and attitudes, the rage and the fury also that I've encountered also in Securitate documents, in a file that was surveying television audiences who was sending letters or was calling the public broadcasters, expressing their dissatisfaction and the regime. And I have here some quotes. For lack of time, I'll go very fast through them. So for instance, someone who wrote to Radio Free Europe, in his letter, he said, although I'm aware of the circumstances in which we're forced to leave, I do not have the strength to go out into the street or stand up at a work meeting to speak my mind, even though everyone else has the same convictions as I do. Consider my letter a sign of inner rebellion, a first step towards it, or a reflection of my own conscience. I do not mean to justify my own cowardice, but only to explain parts of it. We live in a state of intimidation, and this intimidation has become, I believe, the most repressive mechanism of Ceausescu's regime. When, for instance, one is taken from their workplace to the airport to applaud Ceausescu's departures and arrivals, one goes there for fear of losing their job. And then there were many, many callers that would phone the public broadcaster, and I give here some quotes that they were saying. These were all intercepted by the Securitate. For instance, today is Sunday. Are you going to show us crappy programs again? The programs are a catastrophe. We will all go mad. Steaua Bucharest, after a football game was not broadcast on television, a woman burst out in fury. Go to hell. You'll one day all blow up. Stop showing us these goddamn liars, referring to Ceausescu and his wife and the party officials. Someone else wrote a letter saying, I'm an officer in the Romanian army and I would like to listen to the radio and see on TV competent and well-thought programs rather than the rubbish you are serving us every day. I and the entire nation are fed up with you telling us about the comrades Ceausescu, about their and their party's ordinances. And the party are a bunch of crazy, paranoid, sclerotic old men. They brought the country in a state of cruel misery and scarcity as never before. I'm warning you that if you do not change the programs on TV, I'm in the position to destroy the television building and any other buildings. Someone would say, do you want me to be in charge of the phone tonight? It is enough for me to make a phone call and have tanks appear in Bucharest. Let them blow up. Do you want a civil war in Bucharest? Hunger. Hunger makes Romanians lose their temper. Someone else would say, Christ was born only one time and died only one time. How many times was Ceausescu born, alluding to the many programs dedicated to Ceausescu's birthday? Someone saying, our public broadcaster should learn from Bulgarians how to subtitle a movie. My condolences, people were tuning in to the neighboring country's television at the time. What did the Securitate do? This is a report from one of the Securitate officers involved in the operation, was called Malicious. On Sunday, I went to his house, him being one of the people who were repeatedly calling the public broadcaster. Together with my son, he says, he was sober. The house was modest but clean. He avoided any political discussions, maybe because of my son being around. I found out that he comes from a family of communist workers, that he himself was a communist without a membership card because he had been excluded from the party by those at the factory where he had worked. I realized he read primarily history books. He lent my son 3 of his books. He had called in for the first time complaining about a television program showing a visit of our state leader, and he had criticized the discrepancies between what was shown and the social reality, meaning the food shortages in shops. When I visited him, his television was sealed, as he had given up his subscription on the grounds that he could no longer put up with any lies. We parted ways, promising we would see each other again. We never met again, but his phone calls became less frequent and more civilized. I haven't talked to him for at least 4 or 5 months. So this is an encounter between a Securitate officers and one of the people that we saw in those quotes. So based on this, and here I'm arriving to my conclusion, how can we rethink archives, archival scarcity, what counts as archival data and research data in this particular context? So one argument I make, and I'm inspired here by different feminist scholars, is that perhaps these effective encounters with and around Romania's television past, how people talk, how people burst out in fury, Perhaps they serve as an archive of feelings, what Kvetovich says, an archive of feelings and emotions, which are bound not only by their content, but by their context of production. And perhaps we need to look at these archives not for how they link back to reality, but as sites of knowledge production, as well as a repository of and generator of social relations. And I give you the examples of the kind of social relations I had around my different talks around my archival research. So then the history of Romanian television under this context becomes then a contentious site of knowledge production marked by strong sentiments and emotions. Under these circumstances, I argue that perhaps we need to look at how the historical becomes the personal, to echo the feminist motto. In this, what becomes important is the personal. And in this case, the personal includes both the subjectivities and emotions of the people I study, but also my own subjectivities and positionality as a television historian. So what do we learn from this? That perhaps acknowledging that archives are contested sites of knowledge production means that archives are treated not only as representations of the past, but as agents in knowledge production. It means that I, as a historian, am also an active agent in the knowledge production, wherein my agency is inseparable from my interactions with the archived pasts I encounter. That self-reflexivity is imperative for the historical narratives I, as a television historian, produce, and that answering questions such as what do specific archives do, what are the social relations and practices that have produced them, what are the social effects of these archives, are imperative in accounting for the historical narratives produced by specific archives. And to answer such questions, one of the methods to use is doing these ethnographies of archives and archival encounters, which I've tried to touch on and illustrate in also through my own reflections and personal stories around my own research. So this was my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dana. It's a bit late. Maybe we have time for a very concise question from the audience. One question. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, thank you. I had a question for Dana, because it happens that I also worked in the TVR archive recently, not for so many years as she did, but it was a recent, fairly brief encounter. And it was revelatory for me to see the quotes that you provided from the negative reactions to the television of the 80s, because I looked at the letters that I could find in the television archive rather than in the Securitate Archive, like you do, the political police archives, and I could only find positive letters.
Yes.
And literally, that was a question for me. I wanted to talk to you about this. Was where are the negative reactions?
I know what happened.
Nobody was writing to them, so probably there was a curation, a significant one at some point. And
I know what happened.
Okay.
I know what happened. I got to the bottom of this. So the operation was called malicious, of surveying and intercepting correspondence and phone calls with audiences. No one knew about from TVR. The head of the audience department at TVR at the time, he published an article in a book. It's an English-spoken article. And he says at the time what they were doing, they were calling audiences, and they would have these meetings with audiences in factories. In these meetings, everyone was praising the television programs. Everyone was praising the party. So what we see is this discrepancy between what was told in public and what was coming in anonymously. All this was anonymous calls from the private sphere. And this operation, malicious to my knowledge, they didn't know about it. This was Securitate run and kept secret by the Securitate.
So they were basically selecting, curating what the
definitely.
Yeah. And were keeping the positive. Because I read a lot of positive comments from the 70s and 80s, and there was really a major question mark. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. Now.